Hey there, guys. Give me just a minute. We'll get started here.
Join me as soon as he connects, and then we'll roll. Holy cow, that was about as seamless as we've ever been, Phil.
Believe it happened. Wow. Okay.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Very
Like
close.
we're actually acting as if we know what we're doing. I'm going to back up a little bit. That's
Absolutely.
about all the further I can back up. So, all right. So, hey, we're talking tonight about our inner child. Can you just start with like, what does that, what does that even mean?
That's a very long introduction. That's like part of
Okay,
the
let's back up a minute. You want to back? We'll back up and start over. Hi, everyone. This is Phil Herndon and Stephanie Bessett. Phil's here from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, with Sage Hill Counseling, and I am Stephanie Bessett with Decent Life Restoration. And we try to do these Instagram lives about once a month. Sometimes we skip a month in there, and sometimes we're able to get together and do this. And it seems like to me, there's a number of times that I speak with clients, and whether it's around things that have been triggered in their story, whether it's around needing healing in certain areas, that we bring up this topic about, a little Phil or a younger Phil or a younger Stephanie or a little Stephanie, or, those type of things. Or and we talk about the inner child, is the term that is familiar, or the inner family that becomes familiar. Um, what is that, Phil?
well, I have to say, first, I swallowed that drink wrong and it's water. Secondly, I think I see two. I see a Cookeville, Tennessean and a Murfreesboroan on here. Oh, and another Murfreesboroan. I think we're way ahead of you in the snow game in Kansas.
We melted by now.
Yeah, we melted. I didn't want that part. We melted today too, but we've had a bunch of snow.
Y- Yeah, are you supposed to melt tomorrow? Because then we get really cold here again.
We melted today. We make it quick. We
Okay.
don't keep it around very long.
Well, we don't either. It's
So
not like It's not Alaska.
I just want to throw that in while we could. I think we're way ahead in the snow game of Kansas.
Could be. I'm I'm not trying to do anything with it.
I thought you would be amazed. I,
No.
okay.
So,
Well, yeah, inner child. So it to me is one of the most intuitive aspects of healing that there is. You can go into scripture. You can pay attention to the face of a 350-pound man when he's looking at a baby. It's all over the place. This childhood heart that we carry in us. So scripture, it's throughout scripture as far as God talking about his children, being adopted children. Of course, they're the two very famous passages where one where Jesus points to the children and says, "Unless you change and become like one of these, you will not inherit the kingdom of God." And there's the famous scene where the children are running toward Jesus with abandon. Man, they see Jesus and they just make a beeline for him, and the disciples jump in their way, like, "Oh, you kids, stop that!" And Jesus says, "No, no, 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 no. You don't get it. Let them come to me. For such of these is the kingdom of God." And so it's a very biblical concept, and sometimes New Age thinking or mysticism can hijack some things that are very intuitively and even biblically true. And that's the fact that we carry within us the heart of a child. And so children live in delight, and they live in awe, and they live in wonder, and they live with curiosity. And children can be really clear. Like when children have questions, they ask them. And the children can be very compassionate to their friends, their parents, not often to their siblings, but the heart of a child is all through literature and all through scripture, and even anecdotally in our lives. So many, I said today, I work with someone today. It's a men's group that another guy and I do every Tuesday morning at 7. And I said to the men that when we were doing CPE, the treatment center, the guys would often refer to it as an orphanage. They said, "Man, we're just
mm.
orphans, sometimes very highly paid or highly skilled or high capacity guys, very, very adult in their work life, very, very adult in their chemical addiction or sex addiction or gambling addiction life as far as doing grown up things. But they had lost track of that child's heart inside of them. And so they would gather for treatment and be scared to death together. And they were very vulnerable and open. And we didn't say that, they did. They would very often say, man, this is like a big orphanage. So it's, anytime we're looking at the insides, how human beings operate, we are very quickly aware of a child's heart inside of us if we're paying attention.
Yeah, so part of what I hear you saying, if you're a bunch of orphans, that means that you're without parents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And very aware of having the heart of a child, in that case, a scared one.
Yes. Yes. So then what? So it's one of those things where it's like, hey, when I access the fact that there's a heart of a child there, and as an orphan recognize that, hey, there's some things that I totally, that I either wasn't seen, wasn't known, was shamed, belittled, had to become with somebody else to stay in relationship with. And like I hear you saying, it's like, hey, there's this orphanage and we recognize the heart of a child. Then what do we do?
In the context of healing, what do we do?
Or engaging with engaging with your younger inner child. What does that look like?
Well, a step even before that, when you talk about engaging that inner child, it's paying very, very close attention to those things that are childlike. I don't mean childish. I'll give you an example. My grandfather, I grew up the first 7 years of my life next door to him, little bitty houses, probably 10 feet apart. And so my grandfather somehow managed, he was a heavy equipment mechanic, a blue collar guy, born and raised in Northeast Mississippi, big man. Somehow he had maintained access to this child's heart inside of him, and just personality disposition. Well, on the rare occasions it snowed, he would call my mother right next door and he would say, her name was Mary. He'd say, Mary, what's it doing at your house? And she'd say, it's snowing, Daddy. He'd say, well, it's snowing at my house too. He would laugh, and that's silly on the surface, but what he was doing is he was accessing that form of delight inside of him. He loved snow, just big old second generation Irishman, born and raised in Mississippi, heavy equipment mechanic, but who was unashamed to show delight at snowflakes and to call his daughter, who was 30, however old, and laugh with her about how crazy it was to call next door, but it was delight for him. He was in awe of that. So the first thing to do is to be willing to walk through how scared and how many shame messages will come to us to say, oh, wow, inner child, or little Stephanie, or get through those mocking voices that dare us to pay attention to those things inside of us that are very childlike, not child delight and awe and curiosity and clarity and those kinds of things that children do. Heard it said that the children aren't innocent and they're selfish. There are all these other things, but one thing children do, they give pure expression of their internal world. Like, they talk about being hurt. If they don't like something, they say, I don't like that. If they want something, they say, I want that. And we know theologically they have sin. So we're talking about innocence, but we're talking about a purity and a clarity of speaking from the inside out. That's really the core of inner child work or inner child recognition, is, am I speaking from this place inside of me? And am I speaking the truth? And as adults, we know to say it in a civil manner, a gracious manner, a kind manner, an appropriate manner, a firm manner. So we know in our thinking brains as adults how to say something. But a child's heart tells us that we have something to say and what it is.
Mm.
So the first step in that, if you will, no pun intended, the first step in that is to pay attention to the fact that my adult brain, quote unquote, the adult way I can think through things tells me how to say something, but what to say, and that I need to say it comes from a child's heart.
Yeah.
The first step is to walk through those messages that bombard me when I gain access to that child's heart inside of me.
Because part of what I hear you saying, as far as the mocking is concerned, as far as those different things are concerned, that there's a relationship between the inner child being shut down and toxic shame.
Mm-hmm.
Like all the judgment of the child comes from this place of toxic shame, and it's like having a recognition of what that is, almost like in how I teach people is like, hey, have recognition of what that is. Don't just say like, don't do that anymore, because that's not helpful, but have recognition that that toxic shame is there, and almost like literally like remove it or lift the hood up and go, hey, what's going on underneath that, to give the freedom to expression of the inner child.
Mm-hmm. That under the hood part is very important, because and a lot of it is appropriate. We need to be appropriate in how we say things and how we're acting and where we are, what our environment is. We're not talking out loud at a funeral like a 3-year-old. We're talking about, so there's appropriate manner to do it, but that looking under the hood, what's really going on in here, is how one of the ways you're beautifully saying how to walk through those toxic shame messages. Like, grow up, don't be silly, don't be ridiculous, mocking tone. Oh, you're gonna, little Stephanie or little Phil, that kind of stuff, or all those voices that come from toxic shame to say, hey, get tough, think your way out of this, be tougher, intellect, morality, and willpower, be tougher, be better, be stronger, that kind of thing. So those are the kinds of messages we have to walk through, those voices that are screaming at us to don't ever get to that vulnerable place of childlikeness again. Stay
Yeah,
tough.
is that what shuts the child down initially?
Yes, if you remember, one of the diagrams we draw is that we call it the paradigm of recovery. That when we're having a big old identity, a big self, we're speaking out loud. We're telling the truth inside out, as we say. And what happens is, some of it is that parents are human. Parents get distracted. Parents have sleep deprivation. Parents preoccupied with something stressful at work. Parents have maybe other children that are in peril. Like, things happen and children experience abandonment. And there are ugly, unhealthy things that are abandoning, like screaming at the child, shut up, get tough, stop your crying, it's not that big a deal, don't be a baby, those kinds of things like that are very harsh. So either way it happens, the child's limbic system, the child's heart, experiences it as abandonment. And so what a child will do, this child will make up stories about how inadequate he or she is. She'll start talking, well, I'm too much, I'm too loud, I say too much, or I'm not very smart, or I'm not pretty, or I'm dull or dumb or boring or a drama queen, and all these crazy messages that can show up in the heart of a little girl, a little boy, and they will make up a story to explain their abandonment, because the child's heart can't bear thinking about being abandoned by these people that take care of me. So it must be about me. So I better change something to make them okay so they don't leave.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And then it's like the abandonment, the first abandonment that happens in that process is abandonment, of ourselves. Each time that we reject who we are, we abandon ourselves first before we abandon, so that we don't get abandoned, we abandon ourselves. And so part of what I hear you saying is like back when you talked about the snowflakes and the delight and it's like just even going back to those things of, hey, what was it that I liked when I was a kid? What did I smile at? What did I like, and having the willingness to enter back into that world. Like I remember one of the things that I really liked as a kid was to see how high I could swing on a swing. And I thankfully have little kids now. And sometimes, when I was a kid, it wasn't near as scary. If I swing as hard as I can swing now, it gets a little bit scary going, uh-oh, what's going to happen? But the willingness to stick is to go into a place that I enjoyed as a child again. And it brings up those same feelings that I enjoyed as a child when I got to do something that felt like me being me, or when I felt free, or when I felt, most like me,
Hmm.
you know, to enter into those different places.
Yeah, and that gets off into the territory of, they've been called masks, false roles, imposter syndrome, those kinds of things. That's where those masks are formed, where if the child meets with shame, toxic shame for being the way he or she is made to be by God, then that child will put down those things and pretend to not like them anymore and will act right on the outside. And so
Yeah.
what you're talking about is how when a child recognizes they're unacceptable, they will stop accessing how they're made,
Yeah.
start
Yep.
making those stories and those voices. And so they grow up and they're 60, and they will end up listening. Those voices will still be very loud because they've lived a,
Mhm.
as an imposter with a false role out here, not having access to the heart of that child that God still sees.
Yeah. And so when we recognize those voices as toxic shame, or how does somebody begin to recognize those voices? That place where normal is what we know, no matter how screwed up it is. I met with, there's a couple, I met with a client today where it's a situation where there's not a recognition of what that is because it was the normal in the household. And it's like, here's what was being said, but I don't have recognition of that being called shame or toxic shame. And
Mm-hmm.
what's wrong with it anyway?
Yeah, that goes back to two major phrases that are connected to this idea of toxic shame. Healthy shame is I have limitation, I can't do everything, I don't know how to do everything. Toxic shame says, yeah, I can't do everything and I don't know everything and I despise myself because of that. I'm
Mm,
despicable to myself
mm,
as inadequate. And the second phrase is how I label myself when I'm having feelings. It's the second phrase that goes with toxic shame. Like if I grew up in a house where I'm either implied or called stupid or dumb or ugly or to this or to that, then when I make a mistake or when I'm very human or when I have tears or when something gets to me, then whatever I hear inside calling myself, that's my cue that I'm living in
yeah,
toxic. And so
yeah,
it's beginning to pay attention that when I'm human, when I'm limited, when I make a mistake, or when I am at the end of my rope, or when I have a hard time getting out of bed, or when I look around, I'm hyper vigilant in every room I walk into. What is it I say to myself to snap myself out of it? I'm a loser. I'm weak. I'm no good. That's your cue. When I'm feeling anxiety or depression, or I'm isolating in self pity, what we call the impairments over on this side of the sheet. When I'm in those situations and or I am hearing those things about me, that's my cue.
yeah,
That's my
absolutely.
voices that cover the outside of this heart emotionally. And trying to get to that heart, attempting to get to that heart is met with those voices. And I go, oh yeah, I forgot. Oh, okay, yeah, I forgot. I'm dumb or stupid or what. I better try harder or learn more or try to be better. Try.
Yeah. So I hear you. So we start recognizing the toxic shame, and then we're living in a place of like experiencing joy, delight, curiosity, being with people that are glad to be with me. So I'm reconnecting with that younger portion of me. Can you share a little bit of like what is it, when we are triggered story and all of a sudden it's like, part of the things that you talk about is when we go, hey, what am I feeling? And when have I felt that way before? Or when is the first time I felt that way? And all of a sudden I'm drawn way back into junior high school or drawn way back into when I'm 7 or 8 years old. What importance does that bring?
What you mean? What importance does it bring to whom?
Um, so like there's a little girl. So part of what I think that I'm getting at is when we recognize that there's an inner child that's an orphan that was left behind, that there were things that she went without. Not only are we doing joy and delight and curiosity, but also in recognizing, hey, here's some things that, you know, she was really in need of when she was really scared, when she was 6, 16, 46.
Mm-hmm.
And because that didn't exist when she was 6, we don't know how to ask and call out for help when we're 46 or whatever that is in there. And so in that, part of me is looking at that going, hey, if someone can go back to how old they were when they felt that way, there is a child that still has those needs that they went without. And then some of that becomes becoming the loving parent that you did not have. Because what we know is, you know, in many situations, that parent doesn't exist. I mean, may have passed away. And we can't go back to the people who abandoned us and talked to us or taught us how not to have feelings and expect them to fill in that space now. Mm-hmm. And can cause us more harm if we decide to go back to that place again. You know, and so part of that is like, hey, going back to our younger self, there are things that individual needed, and what were those things, which would give me a really big indicator of what is it that I'm needing today.
Yeah, there are some super handy tools that are, well, they're not easy, they're simple. This is just a terribly gross example, but I thought of it today and shared it with somebody, so let's just share it again. A relative of mine had, again, it's such a weird example, but he had a surgery where they had to remove part of his colon. And I remember the doctor coming out and telling us when after the surgery over, he said, this was so simple. It was a really simple procedure. He said, you got a whole lot of that in your bodies. I only took out about 6 or 8 inches of it. He goes, it's a little bitty section, but it was a mess. And so often, if we look at our timeline as a line, there may be a section to it we find ourselves going back to. We may tell ourselves, well, that was only middle school. It was only that year I lived in so-and-so. And it wasn't. And it was so far back and it was so long ago. And we can lose sight of the fact that the limbic part of our brains don't have a clock and it doesn't have a calendar. Like it doesn't to your limbic brain where your feelings are and memories are and impressions where those things are housed. It's not chronological. It's happening now because it's coming up now. So if I can go back to, and maybe it is a small section, or maybe it's a huge section. If I find myself, as you gave the example of middle school, if I find myself going back to middle school and going back to middle school and going back to middle school, it may be a tiny section, but it'd be very important to take a look at that section.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back and looking at that section, even though it's a tiny section, those things that we call triggers, when we experience that again, it will take us back there again. And then all of a sudden it starts piling up, well, at least for me. You know, I know that you don't deal with things like that at all, Phil, right?
Oh, no.
that those things start piling up. And if I haven't paid attention to that portion of my story, then all of a sudden, that's what a trigger is like, you know, it happened then, and then, and then, and then, and now I can't trust people because like relationships are harmful and I'm just never going to do them again. Oh, look, it happened again. And now I'm triggered. And not am I just like in this one instance experience something, I'm bringing my last however many years that I experienced a situation, the same situation, you know, and so it's important to go back in our story and go, hey, what did I need? Like in that period of time where I really would have liked to come home, who would I have liked to have told about what happened? You know, what would I have liked to have said to me? What did I go without? You know, all of those questions. So I can even just give recognition to myself and the inner child that's in there and going, you know, boy, the sadness and the loss to not have a person to come home and tell. And if there was a person to come home and tell, what would I want to have been said to me?
Yeah. Yeah, what you're talking about, Dan Allender beautifully says it this way. He says that until we go, Callie is asking a great question on there. Allender says that new trauma will unearth old trauma. We're talking about is you kind of the opposite direction, but Allender would say, yeah, that's right, Steph. Coming back this way, if you look at what happens now, they're connected. And if I haven't done what you're talking, if I haven't asked those questions, who would I like to have told? What would I like to have heard? If I'm not asking those, this new trauma and that old trauma get mashed up together. And that's where limbic brain says there's no difference in chronology.
Yes.
When I'm in my own personal story, when I was not too many miles from where you're sitting, I spent 1 year in school there, and I was overweight. I was scared to death. I was from Georgia. I talked funny. We moved up to the Kansas City area, and it was horrible. And locker room and teasing and body shame. And so when I'm experiencing some form of that now, humiliation, that kind of thing, well, my thinking brain goes, no, I'm not up there in suburban Kansas City being humiliated. But my limbic brain goes, I don't care where it was. It's double the fun now because new trauma, being humiliated or embarrassed, for instance, is unearthing that one again.
Yes.
It's not buried. Around here, there are Civil War battlefields all over the place, and sometimes muskets or arrowheads will work their way up to the surface of the earth from way down below. Things will work their way up. They will get unearthed.
Yeah. And then what do you do?
Well, let's answer Callie's question to get to that.
Okay.
Asking what are helpful ways to look back and maybe helpful ways, and boundaries are helpful process and painful part. Those are 3 very pivotal questions that lead to your question. So helpful ways to look back are to look at maybe some themes. I just named one for me. Like there has been a theme in my life of I have, I guess you would say, sensitivity to, or I pay very close attention to body shame. Like I have my family has come from morbid obesity. My adolescent years, I was very overweight, and even in my 20s was also that. And so that territory has been a theme for me growing up, having a lot of shame about being overweight, about being pale, about all those other things. And so when that territory happens around body or around exercise, around working out, around someone making a comment, even an affirmation like, hey man, you look great, or you look nice in that, or you're really working on that Peloton bike or whatever, that can even trigger some of those painful memories of the information today is great, good, affirming. It will take me back to, body, for instance. And some have pain with a particular parent, a male or female parent, and they notice a theme like, gosh, when I'm around a particular man or woman who shows these kinds of characteristics or this type of personality or speaks with this inflection, I get really afraid or I get really ragey. And so just begin to notice, like in my life, where do I experience, and the clinicians call it dysregulation, where do I experience dysregulation? And then Callie's question, helpful ways to go back. That's the first step. Look at themes. What are some themes that I see being repeated when I find myself in emotional disruption? Whether it's isolation or dissociating or fragmenting or one of the impairments, as we call it, self-pity or resentment or depression or anxiety. What are the themes of that? And to go back, unhelpful ways to look back are to, now this will be the boundary question too, is to bust through and go talk to unsafe people. Oof. Being prepared to do it first.
Yeah.
Unhelpful way. And secondly is to work real hard. I see this a lot. And when I was in graduate school, there was I hate to say fad that kind of discounts people that were in a great deal of pain. So I don't mean it in that way at all. But there was a big uptick in people retrieving memories they had not had before. And perhaps some of those, I graduated graduate school in 1992, so those early 90s. That was really very common. People were remembering these issues of abuse, and if they happened, I'm glad they will remember them to get healing. They began to research some of that, and we found out that people were not necessarily making up stories. There's just no evidence they had happened, and it was by form of suggestion. And even some professionals were doing people a disservice by saying, well, gosh, the way you're acting, I think you may have had so-and-so happen to you. And so one unhelpful way is to go looking for something without looking at the themes first.
Yeah.
Gosh,
I still like that, to pay attention to the themes, like you said, because like they do repeat themselves. I mean, like, you know, I found myself in a position like that earlier this week where I gave a short talk on something, and all the something was triggered inside of me, and I found myself just like almost like free floating, out of control, going, what's going on here? Because this is not actually about what's going on right now. But in looking back at themes, and then what becomes helpful and easy when we look back at themes, and we've done that work before, then as we live life, it's like, oh, there's that theme, there's that theme.
Yeah.
It becomes familiar, and it's easier to recognize, and it's easier to tie things together. It's easier to acknowledge what we're feeling. It's easier to go, oh, that's what I need in this situation. And so there's some real helpful things, not just in going back to painful places, in that sense, but we are able to start mapping what we need or what is going on when that is happening. And it's like, okay, what do I need when this is happening, so that I don't start spiraling like into a pit, usually a toxic shame pit, that I isolate and go away. You know, and it's like looking back at those themes can be so helpful in staying present in today, in recognition of, oh, I see how that's coming up again for me today.
Yeah, for sure. That kind of speaks to kind of the third part of Callie's question about boundaries. And we've said it before on here, but I cannot be said enough, and I can't remind myself enough, that we need to be very sure that when we say the word boundaries or think of the word boundaries, we're also thinking of the word harm. So boundaries are related to having people stop so I don't get harmed. And on the other, someone sets a boundary with me making sure I'm not crossing that boundary so I don't harm them. The easiest examples are physical, but emotional harm is just as common. And so really boundaries around that would be, there are two really base needs beyond the two we talk about a lot, belonging and mattering. There are two needs that are really important when you're doing this kind of work, this kind of inner child work. One of them is be sure who you're talking to about your story, talking about this child's life back here in trauma, that you have the need for security met. And the need for security is that I can struggle out loud without being abandoned or rejected or humiliated. Like security is, you can struggle out loud with me and I will not do those things to you, harm you in that way. Need for is the need to know there's someone looking out for my welfare. Right. So be sure, boundary wise, to Callie's question, boundary wise, I need to really ensure that the people I'm talking to about these themes, memories that arise around the themes, incidents, snapshots, that I'm talking to people with whom I can struggle out loud and who are looking out for my welfare.
Yes.
Very key.
Those needs for safety and security, and the part that ends up being hard with that is if we have not been able to look back at our story and go, hey, what was harmful here? When we grow up in dysfunctional homes, we may not have a clarity or an understanding of what was harmful. We may not have clarity or understanding about safety and security either. You know, that whole thing, like you said, you know, it's like, oh, well, you know, I'd set a boundary and then someone would, you know, talk me out of it, or they didn't hear my no. It's like, well, that's called harm. you know, and it's like helping people to recognize harm in their story as well, because normal is what we know, no matter how screwed up it is. And we grow up in a home where boundaries aren't heard, you know, we don't necessarily recognize it as harm because nobody's getting, you know, nobody may be getting punched or, you know, or holes put in walls or whatever else. And so it's like, oh, well, I didn't even know that was harmful, you know, like I didn't know that I got to have a no in those type of situations. So some of that can be tricky around boundaries, just in the sense of if someone has not experienced someone who's safe and like security to show up and struggle well and not be shamed for it, it will be very unfamiliar,
Mm-hmm.
really foreign. And to start, for each person to start sniffing that out of what that would look like, to be able to be with somebody, to be able to be know that someone's looking out for you and that you can struggle out loud and not be shamed, belittled, shoulded, fixed,
Mm-hmm.
those type of things. Absolutely. I think we have another question here, Phil. What I've noticed on Instagram Live is they got this little question button on the bottom. And it's like, oh,
Oh,
Wayne's got a couple questions here. It says, if I am feeling joy, delight, curiosity, is there an insightful question I can ask about these? And then he also says, aren't triggers actually a gift? They tell us where to look.
triggers, triggers of that gift, like, it'd be like, it's a great gift, but it can be painful. I don't know how to use them. No, yes, they are. They can be, triggers are like dashboard lights for sure. And so they are, triggers are, Wayne, triggers are indicators that something is going on that I need to take a look at for sure. And that's where kind of, and that kind of can lead to the theme conversation we had, for sure. And I forgot the first question.
And then
Got a great,
the first question was around, hey, if I'm feeling joy, delight, curiosity, is there an insightful question I can ask about these?
that I can ask myself, I'm assuming, Wayne talking.
Yes.
Yeah, the question really kind of in inner child work, as we call it, is what does this remind me of? Like I do, for instance, I do not see a snowfall or a snowflake that I don't think about that story with my 60-year-old grandfather just having sheer delight. And that was not all. He would delighted in birds and fishing for catfish and all this other stuff. But I don't ever, and we just had, you know, unusual for us, pretty heavy snows here within the last 10 days or so, 3 of them. And I thought of him just almost on a loop. Well, then that reminded me of painful things like my dad, and I love my dad and I miss him. And I don't say this to disrespect him. My dad would make fun of him and be very cynical. And so it was very dissonant for me. I was thinking, I'm crazy about my grandfather. And he's fun. He loves me and he talks to me and he tells me stories. He spends time with me. And I love my dad. And I don't know what to do with hearing the sheer delight from his child's heart and his cynicism and skepticism, making fun of him, ridiculing him. And so that reminds me of that. And that's very painful to do that. It's a trigger, back to Wayne's question, around how so often I will hear the words of cynicism inside if I get excited or delighted about something. The cynic starts, that voice comes in and goes, don't be silly. Don't be that. Hey, it's so childish. Don't be so silly. Don't show delight in that. That's not what men do. We're in trucking around here. We don't do that. We play baseball here. We don't do that. And so that's an example. And then the snow thing is linked to my mom. And I had a crazy relationship with her, and because she loved snow like her dad did. And so all these things come up just with that one thought about seeing snow out my window here and thinking about him, that linked to my dad, that linked to my mom, that linked to all these other experiences I've had in my life just around that one topic. And so questions are like Wayne's question is like, what does this remind me of? What else comes up around what I'm experiencing right now?
Yeah. And and then what do you do with it? Like I love like you when you talk about your granddad's delight with the snow, and and everything, and how much that lights up. And then it's like almost the sadness that I feel pretty immediately when you talk about the cynicism, like, because the cynicism speaks so loudly. Like, it seems like the delight doesn't go with us every place that we go, but the cynicism or the toxic shame seems to like be this this backpack that we carry around. It goes, how do we is it just more like experience more spending more time trying to just be in delight enough, or what do we do where we got these two things that seem to like cause tension in our life?
Yeah.
And it's like the cynicism seems to speak so loudly and all the time.
Yeah. This is a static answer to a fluid situation called life, to give a static answer. So that these two men in my life, very prominent. One, neither man perfect, but one very, very consistently vulnerable, delightful, loving life. Little things just intrigued him. He was kind of a dreamer. He just thought about stuff. He asked questions about stuff, loved snow, called my mom, all that. And this other man who was a commanding presence, just in, not like physically. He didn't talk about fighting and beating people up. That wasn't his deal. He was just a very commanding person. He was an executive, and he was a decision maker. Didn't have time for silliness like Snow. So these two men, and so I recognize I have feelings about both of them, and there are all kinds of mixed things. So what I do, and that's, though as static as this answer sounds, I grieve the loss of this man physically. He died when I was 23, my grandfather. I grieve his loss, and I find gratitude for his life. I thank God for him. The first man really in my life that showed delight in me, an investment in me, and and grief that he's gone. And I have feelings about what this other man in my life would say about that man to me. And I feel angry about that and sad. And I feel sad about how he lived. And that too, in a strange kind of way, that too generates gratitude. Because I think about his story, not to give him an excuse for doing that, to say that was okay, but to be able to have both of those. Like, I can have my anger toward hearing that cynicism my whole life, not just about my grandfather, but life in general, cynical. And so hearing that cynicism all of my life, I feel sad about it. I feel angry that I heard that all my life from him. But that does open a doorway to recognize my story with him, that and where he came from. Not to make it okay, but to say it passed on down the line, which brings up anger to say I'm not passing that to my son.
Mm, yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Example. It's far more convoluted than I said it, but in a very static kind of manner. Um,
sure.
these men reminded me there's another man, be 26 next month, my son Luke. It's like, okay, so if I choose between the two, I want him to live in the house of the Father who shows delight and awe and joy and childlikeness and can get excited about things. And I tell you what that allowed me to do. That may sound silly to some. It allowed me to play with him,
Yeah.
get in his world and play with him. And
Uh,
that was not part of my upbringing.
yeah. What makes, you brought up a really good point, because play is so hard. Delight is so like, whew, it's like, it's almost like another muscle that we need to develop, is giving ourselves permission to play.
Mhm.
Like, as much as we do work, as much as we do, uh, the things, the responsible things that we label, is the place of being connected back to the inner child. Yes, to go and play. And it's like, what did when I talked before about swinging on the swing set, it's like, hey, how do you connect back to and give yourself permission to play? Because it's so important. And
Yeah.
it, to me, is like almost not out of duty, um, and making it a check off box, because then it becomes human performance again. But how do I give myself permission to go play? and to step into that and be like, you know what? I know that this is super important in my recovery and with me being me, that I need to go play. So I'm going to go find something really fun to do just to go and do it. Just cuz.
Yeah.
And to not get stuck on what other people are going to think about it unless they're really for me recovering myself, and then they're going to applaud me when I say, hey, I'm going to go and go play. But to give myself permission to just go enjoy and to play. And then what I have found in me being able to play, I have more of myself to bring to the people who care, to my family, to my husband, you know, to my friends.
Yeah.
It builds joy. Absolutely.
And permission is so often found in paying attention to what happens inside of me when I think about going to play.
Oof.
What do I hear? And in my story, I heard you work, then you play. Well, the problem with that is when you grow up into adulthood, the work doesn't stop.
Right.
Called workaholism. And so,
Yeah.
for instance, so there's so much to this inner child work we talk about, or inner child interplay, no pun intended, that has to do with paying attention to grown up voices, not just parents, but like that example right there. I want to go play. For me, it's trail running or riding a bike. Not just for the exercise of it, just because it's fun. For instance, what do I hear inside when I think I'm going to do that? I personally hear, no, not for you work, you're not. Or grown men. And I grew up my day, let grown men out here in the middle of the day. I see grown men out in the middle of those kinds of things. Like, so I have this message: grown men don't do what they want in the middle of the day. Grown men work.
Yeah, and to pay attention not only to what your thoughts are, but what is going on internally in your chest, because it's like even when you said out loud, to pay attention to what your thoughts when you say about going and playing. It's like I can like as soon as you say that, like my heart starts racing, I start feeling hot underneath my, like there's something that's telling me it's wrong to go and do that.
Mm-hmm.
Just by you mentioning, oh, we're gonna go take time to go play. It's like, oh, I'm gonna be in trouble. Who's coming? Are they going to see me? I better stop doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's part of what I think can sometimes even be, frankly, the enemy that says you're here to produce. That's partially true. Genesis 2:15, God put man in the garden before sin. Chapter 2 comes before chapter 3. And so there's a core of that says, yes, we are made to produce. We are made to cultivate and to work the garden, as God said. There's called, the Genesis mandate. Yes. So we can take that core. Yes, I am responsible for living in giftedness and offering what God has given me to offer to other people. In my case, it's doing what I do for my life's work, and you and yours and others in their fields of endeavor, how God's made them. There's a kernel of truth that says, yes, I have a responsibility to work and to bring myself to my work, to serve people that honor me with being under my care. And I can take that and combine that with the messages and end up only producing.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it feels like the right thing to do because I'm not unleashing a child's heart in doing it.
Yeah.
So much
When
of
you
the world
go ahead.
has to do with paying attention to what would I say or want to say to a child that I'm absolutely crazy about.
Yeah. To give them permission to live,
And to
to
give them
not abandon themselves.
permission to make mistakes and permission to have boundaries and permission to do things well, so to speak. Like, it doesn't mean having access to this inner child's heart doesn't mean running wild and doing whatever I want. That's called anarchy. But it means having access to joy and delight and curiosity and compassion, and to be able to ask questions and hear feedback.
Yeah.
Sometimes I need to be told, like, hey, this needs to be done, or those kinds of things. But it's so, inner child work is very, very simple. It's just granting access to the way children live and view the world, recognizing I have adult responsibilities in a world God has put me in.
Yeah, and so
Do both of those things at once.
yes, and sometimes it takes watching a child to know how to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, watching, and there's some sort of joy that when we watch a kid splash in the puddles, especially, you know, if we don't have to change it, especially if we don't have to clean up from the puddles, but there's a certain amount of joy that we can like see that and smile. I remember one of the very first times, like, I don't remember if Tony had come back yet or if he was still gone. My kids were little, 18 months ish. And we were painting the bottoms of our feet and running up and down the sidewalks,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and it's like, I can inside me find that joy where it's like, and I remember being so afraid of getting in trouble,
Mm-hmm.
um, so afraid of getting in trouble. At that time, I said, Tony, and you made the comment back to me that maybe that he's not upset about you guys painting your feet and running up and down the sidewalk. And how much responsibility I was assigning to Tony for my story. Um,
We will make sure that we are recreating our trauma if we're not paying attention to it and dealing with it. Even if it's not even happening, I'll make sure that I'm being humiliated or looked at as ugly or fat or whatever if I'm not dealing with the stuff back here. I'll make sure of
yeah,
it.
and making other people pay the price for it. You know, assigning motive to them. You know, for harm that. I did admit it out loud, Tony. You get to make your comments of thank you, Phil,
I
on
defend
there.
the
Yeah,
fire way.
you know.
So
I know you got your lickings from Phil too, so I'm not too concerned about the fact of him sticking up for you once in a while.
so you know that what he's talking about there will kind of just come full circle. We're getting close on time, but at CPE, uh, and any therapeutic relationship, whether it's two friends that love one another, someone working with you, someone working with me, marriage. I mean, in some regards, um, inner child work has to do with being in relationships in which I can do that, and therapy, a therapeutic healing has everything to do with people being able to safely, under my care, under your care, under a friend's care, safely able to access that heart again and
Mhm.
safely talk through that trauma, those messages, what happens inside when they desire something like a child or when they're in some kind of trauma. All therapy ends up being is safely walking people through that, walking people through the messages we have to walk through to get to that vulnerable child's heart that God talks about.
Yeah, yeah, and the beauty and the permission, and to be with people that will call that out in us.
Yeah.
You know, that will continue to celebrate us when we connect with our child, and and what I have experienced and what I have learned is, um, most of the time the people who really love and care about me like me more when I'm able to access, um, my childlikeness, or who I really am when I take the toxic shame away, when I just have the freedom, and when I just can just be me. And it's like, oh, when they see me laugh, when they see me play, when they see me delight. And really what you've explained to me is like, well, that's who you were prior to toxic shame showing up. And I
Mm.
was like, oh, really? The little girl that is dancing around and is so excited and happy? Like, oh, yeah. And I know that people around me delight in seeing that side of me. but it also lets me know how constricted I've been trying to be good enough, smart enough, strong enough to get myself approved enough to stay in relationship. And all of those things is just a ladder of toxic shame trying to be acceptable. And it's like, oh, no, 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 no. To go back to the little girl,
Yeah.
to be to free.
For real. Anyone out there wants to watch a really great movie to illustrate what you're talking about, rent Christopher Robin. Christopher Robin grew up and left the 100-Acre Wood, and he became a grown-up. He became cynical and unapproachable, and then only going back into the 100-Acre Wood and hanging around with Winnie the Pooh again did he find himself.
Yeah.
Great. It's a great picture of what we've been talking about for an hour.
Yeah, which in turn also gives me capacity to see somebody who is being cynical after I've done my work. I mean, it reminds me of when we talk about, hey, the more of ourselves that we have, or the more that we can stay in our feelings, the more that we can be with somebody else when they're in their impairments, and we don't have to take that on. The person who's being cynical, I can start seeing them in a place that's a person who's really hurting, you know, who has not taken the time to do the work and has a lot of pain that they're dealing with. And it's not my job to fix them, but it also helps me to not take their stuff on and have to react to the cynicism and go, oh, that's really more about what they're going through or their story than it does to do with me. So anyway, I'm getting my message that we only have like a minute left here. And I really enjoyed being with you and talking about this, Phil. It's a topic that can run really deep, and it's, to me, also a place where it's like, it can seem difficult, but it's like, hey, can you carve out willingness just to delight, to go play? It's a great place for people to start. So with that, thanks for being with me here tonight. Thanks everybody who joined, and I will send out the link and so people can watch this later. And we'll try to do this a month from now on the third Tuesday of the month, and we will keep journeying on until then.
Enjoyed it. Bye, friends.
All right. Bye.